Thank you, everyone. Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're really excited today about this BTES special focus session. Come on in. I'm Bob Dermody, treasurer for the Building Technology Educators Society, and I just want to give you a brief introduction to our organization and to our session today, and then I will hand it off to the panel. So we have our editorial board today here for the new journal, TAD, Technology, Architecture, and Design, and some distinguished invited panelists. But real quickly, 2016 will see the 10th anniversary of Building Technology Educators Society. Our mission statement includes the statement that we are an organization of architectural educators passionate about teaching the technology of building design and construction. The mission of the BTS is to promote and publish, which is one of the focuses of today's talk, the best pedagogic practices, relevant research, scholarship, and other creative activity to facilitate student learning, advance innovation, and enhance the status of our disciplines and the profession at large. So BTS has organized 5 national conferences since 2006 and hosted paper or panel discussions such as this at ACSA national conferences since 2007. Our membership is active in the teaching of building construction, structures, design build, project delivery, digital technologies, and environmental design. A major theme which has developed in recent years is the role in which building technologies can play in increasing the architect's access to research venues and metrics, both funded and unfunded. And in parallel, in what way can research in building-centered technologies impact the practice of architectural design? Also want to point out to you, we have some exciting printouts for you today about our new journal, TAD, so make sure you get one of these before you leave. There's a card. We'd love this for you to share this with your colleagues and friends, etc. And also the first call for papers right here for the first issue next year, which will be known as Viral, will be the name of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So now I'd like to introduce half of our panel up here in the front of the room, the TAD Editorial Board. And TAD is a journal project initiated and developed by 4 BTS members, most of whom are and have been officers or members of our BTS organization. Complementary to the BTS mission, the founding members of the TAD Editorial Board are committed to transforming the nature of research. And that's one of the big words we want to focus on today, is how as educators we can conduct research, how we can work with practitioners who are conducting research, how we can even get graduate students involved in research, and how that informs our instruction and our students' transitions into the workplace, etc. So one board member is in another session right now, Karen Braz from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. But up here, on my far left over here, Franca Trubiano from University of Pennsylvania, and Marcy Uline from University of Illinois, and on the far right end here, Andrei Zarzicki from New Jersey Institute of Technology. Now I'll hand it off to Marcy to take us from there.
So good morning, thank you for being here. We're very excited about the launch of this journal and the launch of our call for papers, and so I'm going to run through some things very quickly and then let us get to our distinguished guests who are going to help us talk about research in technology and design. So we have our first issue, and so why technology right now? Because we think building technology and the practice design needs to be reconciled. We think that and we know that there are lots of people who are researching and thinking about this question, and so the time is right to put this in a public education venue to expand our voice in building technology. We believe in the synthetic perspective of architectural design. Technology and architecture are together and not separate. Also, why now is that we have all this wonderful work going on right now, and many books going on, and these are some from our panelists today. So there is a market, there are authors, and there are audience. This mission statement, which you have with you, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but again, it's a translation, integration, and impact of architecture, technology, and design. And so we have 5 different so we believe that building technology is inclusive and not exclusive, and so there are 5 different areas that we are covering. Material constructions, right? So structures, construction, building materials, emerging materials, right? So how do we build structures with emerging materials? Environmental design, of course, energy, sustainability. All of these things are changing the way we shape buildings. Digital design, smart buildings, methods, software development, coding. How do we bring these into our design studios? How do we bring this voice and research further ahead? And of course, project delivery. So if we want integration, how do we talk about that among in our research fields, and how do we talk about the synthetic nature of what we do. And then we believe that there's a history and theory of technology that we need to express, and of course, pedagogical information and innovation. So now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague.
So we're looking to publish journal twice a year in the same kind of half-a-year sequence in submissions September 1st, March 1st. We feel it works well with both the editorial process and peer review process, as well as faculty being able to focus on publications, high-end publications. We'll cover, we are deep in research. We'll cover practice-based case studies, qualitative and quantitative research. And I think the big part for us will be indexing and use different database and impact factor on to provide a very valuable resource for our faculty, both peer review, but also go beyond just basic peer review to make sure it's indexed. We'll be looking for Avery as well, but this is kind of the for entry level. We'll look at Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar. These are very important indexes and databases because will put us on par with a lot of disciplines in science and engineering as far as the impact factor. We believe also that it's beyond articles should not only contain words, it should contain data sets. If you do simulation, you have computer files, you have results, you have all the specs which you use for the research. This should be also part, like GitHub or Instructables, who would like to have this kind of level of engagement. So it translates much more to applied research. So you can actually use journal to do research, not only go on the web and find out how you can do it, what you read in a journal. So it kind of combine both elements. I think it's very critical from the scientific point of view and research.
Great. So as an intro to our conversation, we also are developing an advisory board. As part of this session, we're interested in sharing the birth of the journal, but also this is an opportunity for us to ask our community to join us in this venture. Right? This is it's an opening venture. It's a venture that is intending to create a constituent body of designers and technologists who are interested in bringing their fields together. But in order to do that, we need you. We need our constituent group of interested participants who are looking to not only advance the field itself, this kind of combined field, but also to develop new trajectories that at this point we don't even we can't actually imagine because we don't have you with us. So as part of this, we've developed the importance of the advisory board. The advisory board is essentially a group of experts in their field and in their fields from the 5 sectors that we've just spoke about previously. And we are encouraging, again, our group here to show and to demonstrate their interest in becoming a part of this advisory board. So we have Terry Mayer-Boak, who many of us know because of her long-standing commitment to both SBSE and BTES. Terry has been the author of a number of incredible books that probably many of us use in our teaching that revolve around steel and the use of steel in architectural design. Rosa Shkiano-Fan is an expert in ventilation, and her work, both at the AA and in Italy, operates in the specter of design and ventilation. And Rosa is at Westminster University in London. Thomas Leslie, many of us know for incredible scholarship in the realm of design construction, and the kind of larger trajectory of theory and history. Dr. Christoph Reinhardt, many of us know Christoph's work in lighting, in simulation, and in the sort of almost contextualizing the role of performance in the design specter. Dr. Ruchi Chowdhury is a scholar in energy studies and is in the engineering school at Cambridge University. And Alston Jakubiak in Singapore is also a specialist in lighting. Recommendations, interest, volunteerism in this category would be wonderfully welcomed, and that for us is about having a broad impact on the conversation about how a journal like this could literally change the context for thinking about design in the next 10 years. Now, to help us have this conversation today, we've invited I don't want to make them feel old by saying senior experts. They're not, but they're definitely.
You're only looking at me, right? In
Look
terms
at my mirror. No, and I mean it in the most
of
sense
the old
of.
card,
No, actually, senior in the context of, let's just say, a decade, right? And that's our kind of institutional sort of memory that we have for wanting to reinvent the way in which we think about design, because it has this relationship to technology and to each of those kind of 5 subject fields. But today we have with us Michelle Addington from Yale University. Michelle is the Heinz Professor of Sustainable Architectural Design with a joint appointment in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale. We were just chatting, and Michelle corrected me. Her first degree in mechanical engineering is in actually aeronautical, nuclear mechanical engineering is from Tulane, and her professional degree in architecture is from Temple University. Of course, Michelle also has degrees and a doctorate in design from Harvard. Michelle taught at Harvard for many years, nearly a decade, but also, really interestingly, worked at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and then worked at DuPont. Some of those dream careers that we always think we can do as well as teach architecture, but Michelle did them. And we
Hence the age part.
no. And not at all. And her teaching and research does center on the sort of combined specters of fields that are energy systems, advanced materials, and new technologies. And I'm going to just read a little bit. This is a quotation from her bio, which says that after having looked at research on the discrete control of boundary layer heat transfer using micromachines, she extended her work to defining the strategic relationships between the differing scales of energy phenomena, and of course the possible actions that these would have on the domain of building construction. That sounds to me like a pretty kind of phenomenal way of understanding one's work. We know, of course, of her work in Smart Materials and Technologies for the Architecture and Design Professions, admittedly a book that I've been using for more than a decade, and it's still one of the go-to books that I send my students to when trying to conceptualize what must and can happen to architecture as it changes its understanding of the kind of micro, meso, and macro scales of architecture and technology. In 2009, Architect magazine selected Michelle as one of the country's top 10 faculty in architecture. We also have with us Kyle Moe. Kyle and Michelle, we should not forget and should not miss, are going to be part of the closing keynote panel tomorrow evening. So we're lucky to have them with us, but of course we'll hear again from them tomorrow. Kyle is Associate Professor of Architecture and Energy at Harvard, but he's also the co-director of the Master's Program in Design Studies and of the research lab called Energy, Environments, and Design. Kyle also has a broad and a rich history, having studied at the University of Cincinnati, University of Virginia, and then having a Master's of Design in Design and Environmental Studies from Harvard. Kyle is also a registered and practicing architect, and we have seen much of his work in the incredible list of publications that he has offered our discipline. But I'm also going to, before running through some of them that again are standard bearers on my library and that I pull every week, I'll read a little bit from how he sort of frames his own work in this specter of teaching and research. His research in pedagogy focuses on an agenda for design and energy that is at once more ecologically and architecturally ambitious, focuses on both buildings as manifestations of large-scale energy systems, as well as often the overlooked but discrete thermal parameters that actually take place in buildings, but that actually do have great impact on the power and thermodynamic depth that architecture has. And his work understands this both in how we do research and how we do design. Kyle has a number of really impressive awards, including the Stevens Rome Prize, the Shen Chak Fellow, McDonald Prize, and a number of important design award prizes from Boston Design Biennale and the Architectural League in New York. But of course, it's the books. It's the books that are now part of our heritage that we saw one or two on the screen earlier, that are just changing the spectrum of the way in which our students talk about architecture. whether it's convergence, whether it's thermally active surfaces, whether it's integrated design. I mean, the idea that we actually had a book on integrated design for designers was something that was revolutionary almost a decade ago. But of course, the other works on insulating modernism and the hierarchy of energy with Ravi Srinivasan are also important books. And our third invited guest, Rashida Ng. Rashida is a member of the ACSA board, and she was also a former member of the BTES board, so we love this kind of cross-graining. And Rashida is chair of the architecture program at Temple University at the Tyler School of Art. Rashida has a professional degree from the University of Pennsylvania and actually a Bachelor of Science from Georgia Tech. Rashida's work has also been creative in the way in which it tries to understand this larger spectrum of the environment, ecology, and architectural production. And her work negotiates the often complex, and I quote, interrelationships between the constructed and the natural. And one of the aspects that I think is incredibly important for this journal that Rashida brings to the table is the way in which she says, quote, her work consciously resists an over-reliance on quantifiable metrics that can be reductive in nature. The work interrogates the concurrence of the technical and the poetic possibilities. Of course, in acknowledging the primacy of human experience within architecture. So to sort of set the context for how a journal on building technology tries to understand its inclusive specter, this is something that I think they bring to the work, and Rashida's work brings that quite clearly. Through investigations of both the measurable and the experiential, we can really understand what we call our nascent material technologies. Her work focuses on phase change materials and advanced lighting technologies, and of course we all know her co-edited book, Performing Materials in Architecture and Design, that we actually showed. Rashida has also won a number of important design awards and also has been funded by ARCC, the Pennsylvania Green Building Alliance, and her work has a strong relationship with funded research. And she's also the co-founder and the president of SEAMLab, which is a nonprofit organization for looking at the relationship between materiality and the built environment. So we're incredibly thrilled that we have our three speakers and our conversants with us today. Let us look a little bit at the content that we want to address today. You know, as an editorial board, we've been looking at these questions for a long time. How do we, sorry, this is actually a really interesting setup. I apologize for that. We've been asking ourselves questions that revolve around issues of value, issues of intentionality and theory in relation to technology, and then the question of how do we create new content and how do we measure it. So if we look at these in terms of questions, we have been asking ourselves, what are our goals? What are, in fact, our goals for launching such a journal? Do we actually seek to advance, to bring value? But the question is, to what? And in what context do we seek to bring value? Critically, how do we actually begin to measure whether we're succeeding in doing what we seek to do? And so being able to measure what will happen to the field in 4 or 5 years is something that we are trying to think through in how we continue to structure the journal and launch the journal. Now, essentially, one of the big topics that comes to bear when we're looking at launching a journal on technology is to what extent do we understand that technology is or is not a neutral construct in the way in which we understand design. We could be a repository, a neutral repository for receiving what many of our colleagues are working on, but is that sufficient? Or in fact, do we need to set the question of what technology means within a kind of a larger intellectual spectrum? And this is what question number 2 asks. Are there political conversations that we hope to inspire by having such a journal? If technology is not neutral, probably guessed by the question that some of us think it might not be neutral, some of us think it is neutral, how does technology understand its intentionality? Even Kevin Kelly, who understands that technology, or promotes that technology as a kind of bio-understanding of ourselves as creatures of nature, does understand that we have will, we have to choose how it is that we do or do not live naturally or technologically. And so the question of intentionality is important. And the question of voice thereafter is just as important. The third component is, How do we, in creating a journal that may have as many as 8 peer-reviewed papers over the next little while, how do we collect, curate, and disseminate this information? How do we decide to understand if that collection, that dissemination of that information is actually contributing to innovation? And in so doing, how do we let new fields grow from this exchange? We've developed 5 subcategories, but in 5 years they may need to be different. How do we undertake that? So those are the editorial board questions. What we've done is we've asked our guests to think of 3 questions in particular. The first having to do with author and audience, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this question of authorship and who the audience for the journal is. And then we'll go on to questions of research methodology and impact. But let's just spend a little bit of time looking at the question of author. And then I'll preamble this with a little bit of a statement, and then I'll ask our 3 guests to speak to the question of audience and authors. So in the context where, quote, technology is the new theory, end quote, I don't know whose statement that is, so I have to put it into quotes. Vast levels of architectural and design innovation are being registered in practices where research is considered an important value generator. In the past 15 years, the schools of architecture have all turned their attention to innovations that are taking place in firms, in practices. Firms such as Foster, KTA, EYP, AKT, the Arabs, SOM, Atelier 10, TransSolar, I can go on and on, Port and Townsend. These innovations are actually the direct result of organizational realignments, dedicated administrative resources, and increased funding in architectural research. Software, structural analysis, environmental systems, and architectural project delivery have all been impacted by the research efforts of these practices, of these firms. We're benefiting from them. And yet, we ask ourselves, where is all this vast expansion of technical knowledge actually being recorded, shared, and evaluated? Well, we hope that our journal is a place for that work. The question is, how do we bring that group of audience and authors into the fold of the work that we're doing? There's also a growing cadre of designers that are actually defining their very practice through the lenses of technology. How can we tap into the work that these designers are doing in order to understand that they can contribute to our work? So I guess, part of this conversation is to ask, how else might one define what is this new and unyet tapped audience or author pool for such a journal? In what way can a journal dedicated to the intersection of technology and design solicit scholarship that is from authors who are committed to the values of both rigor and speculation? And what are the qualities of a journal that integrate the vision of the architect, the engineer, builders, scientists, and I can keep going on, because of course the technologist definition is one that requires kind of an inclusive capacity. So with that, I'd like to invite our 3 critics, 3 respondents to talk to this question of how do we broaden this understanding of how we author and how we design technology. I don't think we have a mic in the room.
No, it's a small room.
Okay, all right.
For better. I could see. Well, I'll say that a general observation is, there's an attempt to hold technology next to design here. That's certainly one of the stated ambitions, but I see a lot of slipping back into it. Seems like technology, people interested in technology, talking to people about technology, for people reading about technology. And so one of the issues about audience is how this is actually going to achieve its own ambition of talking to designers and other historians, etc., architecture in general, and that this doesn't simply become what Tafuri described as ourselves talking to ourselves about ourselves. And so I think that that's a major issue, but like the editorial board, I don't see designers as a part of the kind of guidance of the journal, and I think that I tend to think it's going to be guided more towards a technology conversation than, let's say, an architectural conversation in general. And maybe that's okay, but there's a slight contradiction there in terms of, I think, author and audience at that level. And I think that's actually building on or perpetuating some path dependencies that are embedded in architecture education in general, that I think this journal should take the opportunity to kind of flatten out those false ontologies and break those up, and I think we have to do that. Otherwise, we risk just perpetuating prior mistakes. So I think that would be one general observation about kind of audience and authorship.
I think I'd even step back a little bit further, because the question of author is inherently tied to what the ultimate objective is of the publication of the journal. If the objective is to disseminate best practices, and you were talking about examples of what was happening in different firms, that's sort of one approach. If the objective is actually to sort of raise critical questions that drive the way we think about technology, that actually doesn't match with disseminating, what we might consider to be idiosyncratic or individual activities or practices out there, even insofar as we might find them very interesting. And I don't know if the journal can do both, or whether there's, a possibility of having, a clear, overarching sort of set of thematic questions that drives us as we go forward, but to set up what that critical discourse is. I'm thinking in November, I invited George Baird and Peter Eisenman to have a debate about the role of phenomenology, and I really don't care, but it was more to actually be part of a seminal discourse, a discourse that's so important in sort of shaping the way that we all were educated, that we practice now. And we're missing that seminal discourse within the field of technology. How do we begin to say, what is that underlying question that we need to be arguing for or arguing against? We don't have that established yet, and whether or not it's the journal can begin to at least pose, in different issues, what those seminal questions are, as opposed to being just a collection, a repository for disseminating results. And I think that's going to be really key in defining who your author and your audience are, and it's going to be very different. I think there's room for something that deals with collecting and disseminating, but is that an academic journal?
I think it's really interesting. It's such an interesting and great time to be studying technology because of the kind of expanded field. I mean, just the 5 areas that you described show what great interest there is, and I think that that's an opportunity for the journal, but also a challenge, because when we think about who we collaborate with and where information is being created within the academy and where it's being created within practice, and then where it's being created in, I would call it, tangential fields, there's a challenge of figuring out how to begin to communicate in ways that make the work actually relevant and forward the discipline. And when I looked through your presentation and your questions, I thought, is there a common language, even when we look at bringing together different disciplines within technology? I'm thinking about the ACSA conference with the Modular Building Institute that I co-chaired with Brian Smith and John Qualley a few years ago. And there was some disconnect between just ways of communicating within that are very disciplinary, right? So is TAD disciplinary or is it expansive? And the way that articles become focused or not, right, begin to suggest one audience or another, or reach one audience or another. And I think there's great opportunity in that, but there's a challenge when we're trying to necessarily be all things to all people, and how does that shift between issues, and is there a specific focus, or do we try to pose larger questions, and can we do both?
Just to put it in slightly more anthropological terms, I don't even think it's like disciplinary. I would just call it simply tribal, and I think this is actually potentially constructing a fairly narrow language and set of customs within this journal, and I would be careful about that at this point, because I think one of the major questions is, how do we connect, or how does this content connect to the other sessions that are going on right now? How does it connect to the people who are not in this room? who are not necessarily, you know, at the beginning of their day interested in some of the things we talk about. How does this become relevant to them? Because everybody here will read the journal, and that's great. But I think it's the major concerns and questions for me is how does it connect to those, you know, the adjacent tribes within architectural education.
Could I bring up something then that takes us in the total other direction in terms of pragmatics? I mean, you know, you had a page devoted to impact factors. And the other reality that we have to deal with, particularly if this is going to be an academic journal, is how very difficult it is to develop promotion cases for people operating in technology. It's way more difficult to do that than it would be for somebody teaching you know, architectural history and theory, or even for someone teaching design. I take all of our cases up to our provost, and it's easy to make those cases because if it's design, they automatically back off like, you know, if you think it's critical, that's fine with them. And then if it's history theory, they are very comfortable, you know, operating that range. But as soon as it's technology, they don't quite know where to go. And you know, it doesn't quite fit into the practice model for them. It doesn't quite fit into what they're familiar with for sciences. So we have a desperate need to make sure we provide appropriate venues for our young technology faculty coming forward. So we do have to, for all the bigger objectives one might have, we need something that we respect as a journal among all of us that can support the arguments that we make to bring them forward.
I just wanted to say, I think metrics and how metrics are defined. We talked about, you know, how do we define success for the journal. Really understanding where it's used, how it's used. That's so important for promotion and tenure, but it also speaks to the issue of audience and who we're actually reaching and for what, to what end. You know, what happens to that work once it actually is disseminated, you know, citations index, but also other types of measurable outcomes. So I think, you know, there are examples that we can borrow from other disciplines about how to count those kinds of things, but there's also an impact. I guess I'm just wondering if we should think about an impact that goes beyond just those types of statistics and developing metrics or a way of explaining that could be linked to the journal and its outcomes.
So in the context of the example that I started out with, which is that many of our students and many of our faculty members are, you know, thrilled to look at innovations that are happening in a lot of the research practices that are using technology as an interface for redefining design. I think that there are models that we could, in fact, adopt that deal specifically with what you're suggesting us to be careful with, Kyle, which is the tribalism that will happen if essentially technology becomes a kind of self-defining category. Because within a design practice, the technology is in service to either the practice goals for a project or the practice goals for developing research within that practice. So I think that's a really good observation that one has to kind of walk a really careful line between developing strength within the structure we call technology and its value to others, designers. But I also think that, Michelle, your comment about whether faculty that are teaching technology in schools of architecture, in schools of engineering, do have a go-to journal that allows them to identify the merit of their work against others is something that actually is what started this call to rally and to say, I think that there's something missing in the kind of general spectrum of how architectural education is seen by provosts of universities. And it's not that the group that is involved in teaching technology is any less or certainly not less interested in its application, but also in its resonance to actually changing what we call design, and in fact looking at that productive tension. But it's that when they were actually being evaluated, they were not being evaluated for all the time and the commitment that they did put in their relationship with design, but they were being evaluated on their ability to go into their core subject and make substantial improvements or advancements in their field, because they're in the technology field. Once that starts to happen, then the question is measured against what? And then if we're measured against our engineering colleagues, that becomes really difficult because our engineering colleagues are not spending 12 hours a week in the design studio. So there's this kind of dynamic of understanding the figure that the journal should take in order to give merit to the fact that many of our technology colleagues are spending a lot of time trying to synthesize their technology work in a design studio, and so therefore that's why we're really committed to having the design component be really important, because we are spending a lot of time trying to see that become a new form of work. And that's going to be one of our challenges. How do we define metrics within the work that technology has in a design studio so that our faculty can be recognized for that work once it gets published in the journal? But then likewise, the journal also has to be really, really strong because the papers, part of the papers in that journal have to be able to compete with journals that are happening at the engineering level. And so this is where the making of the journal, in terms of its author and audience, needs to become really strong, rigorous, but then inclusive of these different methodologies. So part of the design of the journal is to try to have both of these methodologies appear as valued methodologies that we're going to talk to in a minute. But I do also want to talk to the question of the role of common language versus disciplinary and tribal, because that's a really important one. And I guess I'm curious, since Michelle, you spoke about wanting to make sure that we offered, that the journal offered an opportunity for us to ask really critical questions in the role of that technology has on architecture education. I'm going to turn it over to our guests and say, what can we put on the table that is the elephant in the room for this group that really should be put on the table? Because the individuals that you invited had no qualms about recognizing that as they place things on the table, that they're contentious, that they're going to make friends, and that they're going to make enemies. And not that this is the venue for doing that, but how are we going to basically recognize that technology is not neutral, that technology does have a trajectory that has to be sort of both contended with and then potentially contested? And in what way can we bring into this fold those that can help us contest it? Because while I wake up in the morning and say, oh yeah, I'd like to contest technology, I do it with a spirit of understanding that I'm not the best person to do it. How can we do that? How can we bring into our fold those that can really sort of help us understand how to contest what we think is the role that technology has in design and architecture?
I think just by asking, even suggesting that it's contested. I mean, I think that there's so much about technology that we expect to be deterministic, that we don't put it forward as something that's contested. And this is where being part of design actually allows it now to be contested. I'm thinking about your work in particular, in that there's this sort of challenge to a clear determination, a challenge to the fact that there is a technological, an optimal technological solution that doesn't allow for an argument, that doesn't allow for contestation. But when we begin to recognize that architecture is in the world, and what is indeed maybe not optimal but is possible, it begins to sort of change the way that we address technology and dealing with how to make something possible. I was trying to explain to a science audience about one of our young faculty who was involved in the Million Trees project in New York, and their response was, why 1,000,000 trees? It probably should have been 1,274 in particular locations of a particular species. But 1,000,000 trees makes no scientific sense to them. I said, it makes huge sense to us because it has traction. It attracts, the public. It attracts, different types of nonprofits get involved. It will happen as 1,000,000 trees in a way that 1,724 was not going to happen. That's the world that we operate in. And so always sort of operating, it's not just the technological, problem to solution, that direct deterministic or causal line. It is sort of understanding that it eventually has to be in this complex world with all of these different contexts coming to bear. So we have a possibility for contestation when we begin to strip it away from that narrow, linear technological solution to problem type of thing. And I think for us, I go back and I think about, how we tend to approach technology. We're kind of now at these sort of two polar opposites. We have, God knows how many journals out there, because I've sat on the editorial boards of most of them, that deal incredibly specifically, for instance, particulate matter released from, a very particular type of device in a particular kitchen in Taiwan, and sort of the analysis of that. And then we have tons and tons of those, but on the other extreme, the way we've approached it in design has always been monographic, has tended toward the monograph, or precedence. We don't have anything that bridges the gap between the people who are doing the analytical work and the people who are actually applying to design. And I think that's where that contestation occurs. It's going to be in this question between, determinism and opportunism on this.
I think also that the relationship then between technology and design becomes so important because the methodologies used by a pure scientist or by an engineer or a material scientist tend to go from the broad to the narrow. And what design methodologies do is we acknowledge the narrow, but we actually iterate back and begin to try to understand maybe where those preconceptions started to direct us into a more narrow path and to question those. So I think the value of this journal is to acknowledge that those methodologies have real value in creating information, that we don't have to select those very slim areas of research and kind of follow that to a very fine-tip point and then say we've reached the conclusion. But there exists a kind of multiplicity of conclusions that can be reached if we change our assumptions. So if we begin to iterate those processes over, that's the value of design, research, and technology. And I think this journal can validate those processes for tenure and promotion, but also for knowledge creation that can be used and can challenge some of those assumptions that may be published in a more kind of technically focused, singularly technical focused work that would be published elsewhere.
Yeah, just to build on that, maybe slightly more explicitly, it would definitely repay us, as people in this room, to question our models of inference, which she is starting to point to. But I think traditionally this would be a kind of more deductive type of set of articles that would be published, where some of the other aspects of design tend to be more inductive. But what you're describing as a model of inference is abductive reasoning. And if you could develop a culture of that within the journal and make that explicit, and that would really help make tenure cases. It would help them understand, because we talk about it in these very loose terms, and it's back and forth or feedback or something like that. But it's Charles Saunders Peirce worked this out very clearly in very clear terms 100 years ago in terms of abductive reasoning. Right? And so I think whether it's models of inference or models of causality, I think that's really important. The models of causality is extremely important. It gets at the kind of ontological level of some of my central concerns about this. I still hear architects talking about things in terms of problems and solutions. It's just a completely preposterous setup in my mind. I don't think we have problems anymore. I don't think we have solutions anymore for the big questions. I think all we can do is sort of design. Research and these sorts of things. But so I think it's even at that level of questioning assumptions, really based assumptions, I think could be a huge contribution of this journal if one takes it that way. An example of that would be like the 5 categories. The fact that's, in my mind, again, it's implausible to separate, let's say, material concerns from energetic concerns, from information concerns, etc. Like those, I think those categories already channelize certain models and certain habits of thinking that we need to at least mess around with and challenge. But I think that's something that we just sort of automatically apply. So we do need to question some of our basic assumptions going into an endeavor like this to make it, to realize its full potential and power.
Okay, so since we're in the act of self-critiquing, before I hand it to Marcy to look at research methodologies that we're going to next, I'm going to make an observation. Because we were talking about our colleagues in engineering and the difference between sort of the kind of more working within the detail versus coming, from the whole to the detail. So I'll just put this out there. So one of the things that I find really striking with some of my colleagues who do I would say almost engineering scale research of level of energy, as opposed to some of the work that I might do in contemplating questions of energy, is that whenever, or lighting, for instance, is a kind of a subgroup within the spectrum of a kind of building, is that whenever they're working on a problem, and I know that the problem might be a super very thin problem within this kind of larger field that they call lighting. What's fascinating to me is that when they're working on that question, whether it's a problem or not, they're doing it in a virtual community. And it's an impressive virtual community because they know exactly the kind of subcomponent of that particular question that they have, because their colleagues and their students have already entirely scoped out this entire portion, and they know that what actually is the next sub-question to be asked sits in this relationship to a project that potentially 10 different people are working on. And I am amazed by that, because it really has all this kind of incredible capacity to be community building, to actually be pushing forward a field wherein everyone has their eyes on how that field is moving, and it's actually a kind of it's a growth that happens in competition, but then in collaboration, and everybody knows where everybody is in that context. And it's interesting, but it's really difficult for me to understand how that happens in architectural design. Because in architectural design, there's a kind of a fiction that somehow every project is already all onto itself an ontological reality that has a beginning and end and a future prospect and a back history, all onto the one creator that has made that project. And I actually think that for architecture, that is one of our sort of huge problems. In the context of looking at how collaborative ventures already know how we position ourselves within kind of a larger community. And so one of the kind of dynamic aspects will be how does the work of the project within the kind of design understanding break that boundary of that fiction, right? That's one of those fictions that it is independent, that it has a kind of a virtual independence, and that it's not somehow predicated on this incredible sort of history, but also predicated on a future that it's going to be part of. And I think that's where the world of citations is something that is completely foreign to how we understand the design spectrum. Citations in the engineering world are the ways within which you position yourself relative to even the minutest shift in 6 months of research. We have a hard time doing that. Our conversations and our debates always go back to these kind of meta understandings and have an inability to kind of cross-grain to a conversation that is recorded in how it's moving, and the person can actually. So we're hoping that the journal has the capacity to record those shifts in those differences, but we have to figure out a protocol to do that.
That's such a great diagram that you can paint through your words, but I think actually if the journal moves to maybe, we're never going to be that diagram, but as you were talking about it, I was thinking, well, we've got a z-axis, right? And there's a kind of spatiality to the way that we work that maybe allows us to work within a field, but it's circling over here and up here and connecting over here. So it's, for me, our diagram is much more interconnected. And I think acknowledging where we're trying to connect and maybe even where we're not, right? In defining discrete problems that also kind of reach back out, forward, back, and to the side, and over there, might be really an important ambition of the journal. And the fact that we have a lack of metrics, right, for understanding where that research is happening, hinders our ability to construct that diagram and to live within that kind of virtual construct, because I think it's there, but we're only seeing parts of it. We don't have a full record of indexing. And for that, I think TAD can help in the indexing of its journal, but there's a kind of larger sphere, right, that may be beyond which, we've got to connect to all the other work that's happening.
Well, your comments, Rashida, made me think about in what way we could encourage authors to, in the way in which they're positioning their work within their field, are attentive to the question of how they construct their argument through positioning themselves and then within the design or their technology field.
But the positioning is hard.
Yeah.
And that's because there's not an established theoretical discourse. And I mean, even at the most minute topic, if there's not sort of a clearly defined theoretical discourse that the scholars accept, then what are you positioning yourself vis-a-vis? And I think this is an inherent problem within the design fields, is that when you ask for something to be an original contribution, it's in the science fields, you know exactly what that playing field is. For those of us who work in microfluidics, we all know exactly what that discourse is. We know what is new. We know what is rehashing. We understand what that is. But if you were to bring that up in technology, what defines that datum? Is datum what we're doing right now? Is original simply because it hasn't been done before, even insofar as it may not be original in terms of advancing knowledge? It just might not be a practice that's done before. We haven't done the job, and it's actually going to be incredibly difficult to do. Maybe this is what the journal should push for, is defining what we consider to be datum right now, by which to position what could be a true contribution to that. But that's the real difference in the engineering communities, is that we all know where datum is. That's what makes it so easy for us to form that community and communicate to each other.
I'll leave you the.
Oh, yeah. I agree. Yes. Next
With that,
technology. Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been sort of hinting about, and I think one of the things that makes strides is this idea of research methodologies, right? So we're asking for these topics and areas. In structures, we can do performative metrics, we can do case studies, we can do qualitative interviews, we can do theory and history. And part of the way that we make these strides is we understand what this methodology is, and then we fit within that methodology. And then we prove that we are making contributions by using methodology that other people then rate us on, right? And so the issue here is trying to bring these subjects together. Is how do we either reconfigure, expand, set up a new set of metrics that we can use to not only measure what we're doing here and the questions that we're doing here, but the synthesis of the two. Right? So how can we, this datum that you set out, what is the datum? Where do we start with the research methodology that that this is peer reviewed and measured?
Just to actually kind of connect these two last comments and questions a bit, I think there needs to be, there's some lofty ambitions for this journal, which I really admire, but I think you also need to understand, I think there needs to be to some degree, some education. Like, I think the journal has to sort of, if it's articulating what these datums are, or articulating what some methodologies might be, like there might be peer-reviewed sections of this, but I think there might be other things that are just articulating to junior faculty what some of these things might be, right? Because some of us have training, some of us don't, et cetera, on what that might be. But there's a lot of people with MArcs out there who are interested in this domain, and MArcs don't train you for establishing those methodologies, et cetera. And just from my experience on the JEE, it's most of the editorial work is actually just training somebody how to write and how to cite things and et cetera. So there's a lot, but I think especially within the kind of technology domains, or sometimes people who are not excellent writers unto themselves or whatever, like there's going to be a lot of sort of coaching. But why not make that part of the format of the magazine or the journal in general? Because I think it will help establish what it is, what it's doing, what its goals are. So I think we can talk about methodologies, but I think you also have to push that a little bit. You have to provide examples. You have to be leaders for that through the journal to develop that culture. Because I would say it doesn't necessarily automatically exist right now. Right? It does that.
So does that mean, this is a standard methodology, we take it, we look at it, one of the things that we have to think about is webinars for potential authors, right? So webinars and how to, but also I think it's also the bigger question of what is valid in that methodology, and what is valid to authors, right?
But it seems like you're going to have somewhat thematic issues, and whoever's leading a thematic issue or something like that, I think it just really needs to be part of that kind of introductory essay, kind of laying out the terrain. But there would be ways of developing that kind of culture through the kind of explicit editorial activities of the journal. That would be extremely important to,
Are you suggesting that the research methodologies might even shift with themes, or are you suggesting a kind of broader direction that the journal might begin to define just for this?
I would just say be explicit about it in each case. If it's more of an information, digital sort of issue, that there's a discussion about what that is in terms of methodological terms, and just I think just being clear about it, in each case. Assuming some of the audience knows maybe perhaps very little about that. I think that'd be a good baseline to start, because if you were just starting in an engineering journal, it'd be completely different. So.
I think one of the things that's key here is that this goes back to what that research community is, in the sciences, is that particular topics are associated with particular methods. And that's what forms that community. And, we don't have a definitive method. And I used to teach the research methods class for the doctoral students at Harvard when I was there. And when I took over the course, it was 1 week per method. And 1 week you learn how to do a longitudinal analysis, the next week you do case study, and it would go all the way through. And we have kind of this, fallback in architecture of everything becoming a case study.
Right, yes.
Even insofar as actually it's a very poor method for doing quite a few things and not applied particularly well. But we were loose and fast with what are considered to be, true research methods. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but that's also what denies us, the clear definition of the field, the clear definition of method in terms of being able to actually evaluate something in relationship to that. And it could well be that, one thinks about the journal as a series of sort of like these simultaneous, layers that, you might have, topically driven things. You might have, along with the topically driven things, there might be, a series of methods that one begins to approach or sort of introduce, throughout the years on this. It might even be interesting to see how a topic is explored through multiple methods, or it might be interesting to see how one method, is applied to different types of topics. It could be, a wide variety of different topics, but there's a very clear method thing. But one could see this in all these different levels, and that would be part of, the journal, the role that this journal has that I think has to differentiate itself from other journals, is this role of education, not just dissemination, but education, and that would be a key way that it could do that.
I think to your challenge of the categories, and I'm wondering whether or not the research methodologies becomes foregrounded over the categories that we all understand to be very much overlapping. And then, in terms of the validity of the work, right, and understanding the kind of mapping of the field, that might be so much more useful because the content, right, actually shifts and is maybe more difficult to describe. A validation of those research methodologies is actually so important, and that speaks to an audience and to what the kind of trajectory of use of that particular scholarship is kind of moving forward. So that might be a kind of another way for the journal to frame and also to offer such an important service to academics who are publishing and even those who are not publishing in the journal to really understand what those categories are, what the validity of those different methodologies are, and then how it leads, and then even how they might intersect with each other within the work.
since everybody's nodding along with that, and so that's good. So we'll do that. We also, I think it's important at the same time not to necessarily be too insecure in this question of methodologies or construct the questions in terms of deficit, in terms of what we lack and what engineering has, or what the social sciences have, what the humanities have, and we don't have. But we actually do have a pretty rich discipline history, and it's sloppy and it's messy, but we have a way that we think that nobody else on campus does.
Right.
And now we have a lot of disciplines coming to us and saying, we want to learn how, we want your methodology, right?
Right.
And so we also need to be very clear about that, that we do have this very sloppy thing
We're
that
not
we do,
We're
right?
not.
Just for instance, Pierre Balloge and I taught a MDes research methods class at the GSD last spring, was just simply media's method. It doesn't matter what the kind of preoccupation of the student or the designer is that they're always doing something, right? Like they're sort of technology, they're working something on digital fabrication, they're working with stuff, or somebody's out in the field, or somebody's in an archive, but there's always this media, and that actually determines a lot of how architects abductively work through their research, right? And so I think that's also very important that you guys are very bold about that as well, that we could shore up, we can learn from some adjacent disciplines, but we also, that's part of the educational component is establishing what we have to offer the rest of the units on campus, right? And so I think that needs to be part of that dimension of the methodology discussion.
I'm wondering if you all have made this bridge between the two tribes, let's say. I'm wondering if you could, because I think, and part of this is a language, right? It's how we speak about this, how we categorize this. But if you could share some of your personal struggles and how you sort of started to reconcile it, or sort of your successes or roadblocks that you might find, something, because you have this product, you have this work, you have this research that has done this, right? And so the rest of us are sort of wanting to be there.
You're not nodding anymore.
Yeah. No, I can jump into it. First of all, it's not a struggle. This is something I'm interested in. I wake up thinking about it, and I'm passionate about it. I refuse to accept that architecture can be chopped up into these sub-disciplines. There's no building that we all like that can be chopped up in that way. They're all historical, they're all technological, they're all spatial, formal. Everything we like about architecture is all those things, right? So it's preposterous that, for me as an architect, so I just refuse to fall into any camp, because that's already giving up the question.
I think mine is such an unusual and idiosyncratic, background, and that when I was a mechanical engineer, I was a mechanical engineer. When I decided to become an architect, I was an architect, and I actually never intersected the fields in my professional life. And it really wasn't until I was teaching architecture when, as I was explaining, when I first started teaching architecture, my first class I taught watercolor painting. I taught all the no one knew I was a licensed mechanical engineer. And when they found out I was a licensed mechanical engineer, I was handed that Stein and Reynolds book. And that was at the point when I thought, I really, really need to go back and figure out how to bring the two together. I think it's so idiosyncratic, but I feel as though because I existed in those fields independently, as opposed to, I didn't study architecture to bring mechanical engineering to bear. I wanted mechanical engineering to go away, and I want to do that. And so I don't think I privilege one or the other. I love from my engineering world that I really do know how things work. I love from my architectural world that I can operate in multiple different contexts and also challenge this idea of problem and solution. I know you hate those words, but to me, it's not so much an integration. It's more of a it's not so much just operating the gaps between them. It's the kind of fluidity that when I'm in an engineering group, I speak their language. When I'm in the architectural world, I speak their language.
And that's, I think, despite one of my titles of my books, Michelle and I have a lot of issues with the word integration for multiple reasons. at the kind of within the curricula, the idea that everything can be integrated at the building scale is preposterous, and that's something we have to get over. But in terms of, there's a way in which, like kind of semiotically and syntactically, the word integration maintains the two separate things,
Yes, right.
right? Fundamentally. And we're trying to make a third term that crosses them. That's already a kind of problem of knowledge, right?
I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, so it's just like, for me, it's just like, that's why flattening out the categories is extremely important. For me, it's just architecture, right? And then, because I know that's somehow different than engineering and anthropology, but I know what architecture is, and as soon as we start chopping it all up and then trying to recombine them, we just, as humans, as modernists or whatever, we've never gotten back to the synthesis question, right? We're so good at kind of chopping up the world into little subdivisions. We don't get back to the kind of difficult whole, which is, architects are, we're one of the few disciplines that has to look at the kind of a larger picture, right? And so I think just, like that integration word is a very tricky thing at this point.
For me, it's about knowing and being excited about all that I don't know. So I don't work alone, and it's about collaboration with mechanical engineers and biologists, and really understanding. And I have the best meetings with people from other disciplines to talk about. I like to come up with really kind of crazy ideas and questions, and then bring together people that are a lot smarter than me and got so much expertise in another area, and talk about how they would address what are their methodologies for addressing that question, and then kind of maybe disrupting those with my own naive questions, which I can get away with asking because I don't have that background, and I can say, well, can we look at it this way, and are we somehow prejudicing our results by moving in that direction? So it's really working with others, and who often are not in architecture. Sometimes they are, but that for me becomes a really productive methodology, because then they've got the map in their discipline, with that for phase change material, for example. So I can kind of rely on that, and then I can apply design processes that maybe are more open-ended within a context of other methodologies. So in a way, I'm kind of benefiting from those different maps, and then I feel less reliant upon having one myself. I don't know if that's really a productive way of working, but that's what I've done.
Okay, so this may be it's either going to be a short or long answer, but the part of the critique about architecture not having distinct methodologies that we point to is funding, right? And so funding agencies, not only as recognition of tenure track faculty that their work is meaningful, but actually to do and build the things that we want to test. And so I'm wondering if there are things that you can see that can either better position us, or we can borrow from our engineering colleagues, for lack of a better discipline, to help us try to leverage some of this funding, and try to create agency among agencies that fund it.
I think for the funding question, part of the big problem is that the way major funding works, and the major funding is all going to be science-based, it goes back to defining what contribution is. The calls will be extremely specific. They will relate to sort of understanding what that accepted state of knowledge is, and it'll define, whether it's gaps or sort of moments to bring them in. So it's extremely specific, and that's what makes it very hard for us to engage in. The few sort of breaks from that, the NSF has been interested in sort of much more open-ended types of not open-ended in terms of time, but open-ended in terms of definition. But there's not that many of those out there. They end up being problem solution. So if you look at where perhaps the majority of money goes into building technology related funded research, it'll be something on almost entirely on solar heat gain factor and glazing. A huge amount, and then they have in their mind exactly what needs to be worked on in that, and that ends up not being the kind of question that really moves us forward. It isn't. They're not able to sort of step back and ask the bigger question, but that's how that type of funding begins needs to work. So I'm not sure how we begin to challenge that and how we work within that. I mean, we go for seed grants when we can, we go for these smaller grants when we can, but we haven't been able to leverage the way that we think in terms of sort of changing the direction of these types of calls. I'd say the NSF is at least now starting to talk about this. And so there's some possibility there that we'll see different types of funding open up. And there is a tendency as well with all these different funding agencies to require interdisciplinary, teams. And so there almost always somebody from architecture that's plucked because it doesn't matter what the topic is, there's some feeling that somebody from architecture would qualify for that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're bringing it into architecture, they're just becoming a member of that team.
And within that kind of structure, the architect is always going to be a relatively minor participant. They might be listed as a co-PI or something, but their actual contribution and therefore percentage of that grant is pretty often fairly insignificant. And if you're at an institution like mine, which will take 69% overhead of that funding, once you're on a team of 6 and you then take a sixth of it and then you take 2/3 of that away, you get down to a pretty small number. And so for my purposes right now, I can just do a lot more work with $50,000 grants and like that scale of funding because I can just do the work, right? And I'm not burdened with an incredible bureaucratic infrastructure that is actually inhibiting the kind of work that probably needs to be happening, right? So the way in which, say, architectural inquiries being channelized through those mechanisms, that is a grave concern of mine for sure. So I don't know if we have to decide either we have to get very serious about talking to the NSF and really help them understand what we do and why, or we need to place less emphasis on it in terms of tenure criteria or something like that, because there's an inherent conflict and there's a huge gap between understanding. So if we're going the kind of neoliberal track where it's just like pure funding as a kind of indicator of accomplishment or success or competence, then that's fine. But then we have to really go after the NSF in a major way that we're not right now at all, right? So
This is making me think of 2 points to add in this, one bad and one really positive. But the bad one is that where the major money is, which will tend to be from government agencies, schools of architecture don't have the type of administrative structure that knows how to handle grants. I mean, they're unbelievably onerous. A small Department of Energy grant really does require a full-time staff person who understands the bookkeeping that's involved in it. That's very problematic, and so how schools of architecture begin to sort of partner across the university. But here's the good thing. I mean, there is, and it's been very interesting to see, and I don't know if it's limited to the sort of like the greater New York region, but there has been an astonishing amount of money coming in to deal with resilience.
Yes.
And this has been something that's been really interesting to see how quickly, our field, and then not necessarily architecture, but the architecture writ large, has become a major player in that. And I think that might be something that will continue. And that's, I think, one really bright spot where we can have a major role in significant funding, but also significant technological development that will take place there.
And just to be clear, that funding comes from places like the Rockefeller Foundation.
That also has been
other-
from HUD, it's been from a variety of different agencies.
Both governmental, non-governmental, paragovernmental agencies, and it seems like a much more clear way where somebody's coming to, let's say, design disciplines with an understanding of what the contribution can be, and that's great.
Okay. So the word contribution came up, and so I will now turn it over to Andre.
So I think we already talked a bit about impact, but I'll try to push it into a broader discussion as well, not only engineering or curve design. I'll probably start with the kind of Andrew Bacon. He said in his Design of the Cities, he formulated the principle of the second man, and he actually stated, quote, "It is the second man who determines whether the creation of the first man will be carried forward or destroyed." And I think it's kind of classic of urban design and history, but I think he touches on the intricate ways how the impact and significance in architecture is being kind of registered. And qualitative and individual design becomes physically bound and collectively shared, in a sense, through complex processes of cultural, social, and technological validation. With increased integration of technology and scientific thinking in design disciplines, and with architecture's aspiration to maintain its cultural and social relevance, the question of how design achieves broad impact at all the levels while being comparable with the measurements and impact of the disciplines like STEM, I think it's very important to us. And we have a number of questions we'd like to maybe ask, or you can choose some of those. How is the impact defined and measured in the combined fields of building technology and design? This is kind of a little bit of narrowing the field. What is the in what ways can technology and architecture identify their own metrics? When we talk about the impact, we often take the words from engineering, but more and more we realize that a lot of those terms would have to be redefined by ourselves. And this is this kind of very old saying that says that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So it would be nice to kind of hear on this aspect, but also I think more importantly, how do we make what Franca mentioned before and in discussion more additive knowledge? So we build on our colleagues and we kind of start filling their gaps. Because right now a lot of the discussion we have in architecture is based on self-discovery. Each of us discover the same thing again and again, and we don't really tap to somebody's knowledge and knowledge that we pass to another person. So this kind of element of how we build knowledge, establish a datum, actually is actually exactly what we kind of should do, and how this datum is being continuously redefined and repositioned when we educate everybody what is now critical topic in design and how the impact it's kind of measured. We don't try to be necessarily mechanical and always quantitative, but we have to make sure that we know what we value.
It's a really interesting thing that I find when I'm doing beginning research on a topic, the kind of state-of-the-art articles that come out within engineering disciplines. And those, I mean, they're such useful articles, right? And really recognized as being so important to knowledge generation within the field, because you go in and it's all there. And you know, one thing that strikes me about a difference between the way that we operate and the way that engineering does is we don't actually value that kind of collation of the existing, a kind of collation of, you know, the kind of a synthesis of previous research, you know, that is published for everyone to build. And I wonder whether or not we can begin to structure within the journal a way of an acknowledgement of that as being important for kind of moving the discipline forward. So within you know, a themed issue, if we, you know, invited papers that actually collated, you know, and
Literature reviews.
Literature reviews, and not only, you know, the kind of scientific, but also the kind of project-based outcomes that come out of the design-based outcomes. I mean, that would be such a service, not only to people in that area, but just as a methodology, right, of furthering research that would have a really important impact, critical impact in the ways that the research that we conduct becomes kind of disseminated and then built upon, right? And it would discourage some of that, you know, the discovery and rediscovery that you just talked about, because there would be a kind of article that would begin to synthesize.
Yeah, I totally had forgotten about that. You know, I remembered, you know, when I was doing my doctorate, how critical those were. You know, each journal had this annual review, and it wasn't just of articles that it published. You know, it really was establishing that state, and you had that as a touchstone. You know, you could begin to sort of work against that touchstone. We don't have that. That would be an amazing contribution to have.
Like a slightly different tack in terms of impact. Immediately what comes to mind is just for me and for Michelle, architects and engineers, et cetera, this kind of general field, we're always working on the wrong order of magnitude. Like we're always working on things that are relatively insignificant. So in my mind, I think it's not necessarily the job of the journal. It could be part of these state-of-the-art articles or something like that. But we just have to establish what can the architecture actually do? What can it have? What kind of impacts can it have to do? And from a systems ecology point of view, there's ways to really address that, quite clearly, right? But I think architecture, we're also suffering from a lot of research into things that are either already known and well established. Like I can't tell you how many digifab screens I've seen dividing up a gallery with pretty light on each side or something like that. Like we keep rehearsing things that are absolutely known, and in my mind, they might have like slight aesthetic contributions or something like that, but from a technical journal point of view, almost zero contribution, right? And so there's extremely limited impact on certain forms of research and other things that we're not even articulating to ourselves that would have far more impact, right? So I think there needs to be some evaluation of what sort of things actually do matter that have impact. So there's a kind of question of how do we talk to ourselves and educate ourselves. And
It's an excellent point. Actually, yesterday on one of the project sessions, the landscape session, a colleague of mine actually mentioned something that with 3D fabrication, idea of pavilion is overplayed. It's so much.
Oh my God.
Well, yet another pavilion. It's not making fun of anybody, but it's like we have to do a next step with the discourse.
Yeah.
But kind of talking about the tribalism, because I think it's an interesting question. Do we have also some ability to laterally connect with other disciplines because of technology as a kind of lingua franca, new way to kind of interact and understand each other? Maybe this goes to the question of how can technology increase architecture's overall impact on economic, scientific, cultural, material, and ecological metrics in the construction and engineering? How can we, while we are nervous about the tribal, is this some sort of new way to actually feed in and get a feedback from other disciplines? And I'm speaking maybe from my experience. In some classes I teach, half of my students will be computer science students, for example. So it's interesting. I enjoy this because they can do things my design students cannot. So I think but they also see a value and they also connect, yes, they like the kind of making and mini studio quality because many of them never touch anything with hands and they do laser cutting, 3D printing, but they also bring ability to program, to actually feel very happy. If I ask them to do a PC board for some kind of electronics, they just jump in and today's matter is done. And this is what they're making kind of a culture. So it's just some way we can establish actually new dialogue with the disciplines because of the technology, because we speak the same language in many ways. Any thoughts on it? And would this create a different impact platform for us?
So are you suggesting that this is yet another overlay? Another sort
Well-
of possible, if there's a method overlay, there's a topic overlay, and then there's a disciplinary overlay?
Oh, we talk about things merging, and I think it was a good point that architecture is splitting into different categories. It's a bit artificial. But one could go even further and say that architecture from engineering, it's split separately because Brunelleschi was a builder person and he actually did both. So if you kind of go in the opposite direction, is a technology, the element that actually combines, actually makes it much more inclusive beyond architecture, in a sense. That's why
well, I don't know. I mean, when you say lingua franca, I don't know. Actually, I don't think architects speak the same way about engineering or about technology as engineers do, or a scientist would, or as a historian would. So I don't know if that actually so neatly cuts across. Like, if maybe there's a few syllables that sound similar or something like that, but it brings up the question of the kind of language that would be used, but I don't think it automatically cuts across so neatly. And it's also like there's a kind of slight technological determinism in the way that you constructed the question that technology has these impacts or technology, has these connections across, and it rarely works that way. It's the way that we think about technology and use it and describe it to ourselves that will make those connections or not. So I think it's like we have to, within that question, we have to recognize the agency of both like the stuff we're working with and how we're doing it. We'll either make those connections or not. So I guess it's sort of latent there, but it'd be hard to work. Like, I wouldn't necessarily suggest to get another overlay for that because I think it's fairly tenuous. Should be constructed more clearly.
I don't know if we've constructed this so that I can't jump in. Because actually, we're gonna be hearing from our audience as well, right?
Yeah, we would like to hear some.
So Kyle, not to be polemical, but are you suggesting then that there's a difference between technological determinism and what Kevin Kelly sees as a kind of a naturalism to technology?
Kevin Kelly. No, I mean, no, let's say, all I would say is that we just need to recognize the agency of all of those actors, right? And so you can describe that as a type of naturalism or something like that, but I was just sensing a little heavy on the kind of granting the technology too much agency in that particular question. So it's going to be polemical no matter how you position, the kind of spectrum of technological determinism in the journal. But again, I would just say be clear about what the, what your operating assumptions are, and that would be fine from my perspective, because people are always going to react to it. And I think that would be a healthy and important part of the culture of the journal to establish.
So we are short on time. We still have to take a couple of things about the first issue, but I want to hear also from people who are here. Questions to us or our guest panelists, and I guess
I would like to second, if possible, this notion of it being an education tool for, well, you're touching on me perfectly. I practiced for 10 years, stumbled into teaching, have loved it, but an MArch. I've even returned for a little post-professional degree, but have spent no time, absolutely no time with the notion of methodologies and research. And so the attempt to maintain critical work and practice is something that I've tried to bring into my vocabulary, but the idea of I'm presenting a project tomorrow, and really I'm not even going to present the work. My goal of it was to present it as, how should I be talking about this? I mean, that is exactly what I'm struggling with. So the idea of a magazine like this, I'd subscribe.
That's one of them.
We're trying to raise the issue price.
Can I cause a problem? I'm gonna do that. I have a question, and my concern, and it's maybe just the framing of the talk today, but my worry in looking at the role of architecture and what architecture is in the future is to wonder what are the aspects that you're thinking about and the panelists can speak about. I'm always worried that tech will be building tech and then it will be high tech, when we mentioned Foster and other people. And when we know the world is now being shaped by things like personal water filtration devices, housing for refugees, what are the aspects of small tech, low tech, vernacular tech? How do you make it so it's not already saying architecture is buildings and international large-scale projects, but then how do you shape a journal so it isn't all things to every person, as you said? How do you do that? How do you make that something that's important so that we don't limit the discipline at a time when the discipline is probably going to be shaken to its core in the next 50 to 100 years?
Yeah, I think this is an absolutely foundational and fundamental question, and I think it deals so much with the fact that when we tend to talk about technology, we're looking very inward. So we're dealing with our normative practice, and therefore what serves our normative practice, and we're always looking to, we accept the technologies that we have, and everything's sort of operating subordinate to the technological systems we have. So we tend to push towards their optimization, which takes us forever in the more advanced materials, the higher tech type of movement. If we could begin to understand technologies as means and not ends, as instrumental as opposed to sort of like the subject of what we're dealing with, or the content of what we're dealing with, we would start to deal with what sort of the entire range of solutions would be, and would actually start to make us a whole lot more relevant. But that's part of that shifting, is whether or not they're instrumental or they're actually the instruments or the things, the ends that we're trying to work with. And I think too far we've thought about them as these things or these ends and have worked on optimizing them rather than on understanding and exploring their instrumentality.
Yeah, I'd like to read quote from Leo Marx in his last essay. The popular belief in technology as a primary force shaping the future is matched by our increasing reliance on instrumental standards of judgment and the corresponding neglect of moral and political standards in making judgments about the direction of society. To expose the hazards embedded in this pivotal concept is a vital responsibility of historians and I would say designers of technology. So my question is, does the editorial panel have a definition of what technology is?
I'm so glad I'm not on the panel.
I would go very broad and anthropological, in a sense that technology is what we devise to improve our life, improve the world around us, and our relationship with the environment, in a very sense. Maybe computation at some point was agrarian technology because we could survive from this. And it's kind of linked to James Burke idea that you create a technology, and then technology starts really finding you socially. And we may not always like this, but this is actually reality on this kind of, in his book, X-Maker's Gift, meaning that you create the axe and that axe really defines how you behave with this. So technology, again, is a form of how we relate to environment and how we change it. If you put a cloth on yourself, you will develop technology. At some point, it was critical for us to...
But Leo Marx would say it's actually how human beings relate to human beings, not how we relate to the environment. That's sort of like the mechanical system. It sounds a lot like
Well, technology, it goes well with the environment, but also with people in the same way. But in this case, technology will be something how you live together, the fact that we can sustain cities because we have technology that brings us food and develops food. In the past, we couldn't sustain so many people. That's why we have different types of society, kind of in an anthropological way. By developing technology of living, agriculture, and so on, we create the city. And this has an environmental impact, but also social and cultural impact, right? So each technology over thousands of years had this kind of stamp on us. And assuming that today it's different than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it's the same. It may not always has positives, there are some negatives. People would say that by going to cities, they would lose touch with the environment. We had quite a few projects yesterday talking about China, how globalization and how they kind of moved the cities, detaches people from the being on the ground and working with farmland. But that's kind of my take. I'm not sure how other people see
Well,
environment and people.
I just want to say, maybe we need to invite all of ourselves to a couple of evenings with some really good wine and actually have this conversation, right? Because, one way that I would sort of think about that is that that question is at the core of what the journal needs to understand in the way that it identifies.
But you seem to suggest that we needed narrower definitions of research, not broader ones. So I'm curious about how you reconcile those two.
But I let's not try and figure out what technology is right now, because I guarantee you're not going to get it from a group of architectural academics on a Friday morning. But I think both questions...
Afternoon?
Is it evening? Oh, now it's afternoon.
No, I mean, would it be better for the afternoon?
After drinks would be close, I agree. But I think to just connect both questions, I think more than a definition of technology, I think like understanding what the ethos of the journal is incredibly important. Taking that charge, which I read is the kind of impetus of your question, that is in fact more important. And it is an ethical thing to take a stand on what the definition of technology is, so I understand the question, but I think that it is really important. And I would say that it has a sort of, the imagery that you're using, the language you're using, the innovation, etc. It has a overt neoliberal focus, orientation, and I would challenge that at this point. Does a technology journal need to have that de facto to get started? When I think in terms of impact, urbanization is much more significant question, and or the fact that how most of the world lives and what kind of structures they live in would have far more impact, or the question of air conditioning in India is going to determine more than a lot of these things. So I think the kind of ethos of this is really important, but I think it is rather inward looking right you know, it's super Anglo, it's super North American, and I think that should all be open for questions as you guys move forward. Yeah.
So maybe just quickly before we lose everybody, we have two issues in workings. The first one is titled Viral, and it focuses on on the kind of technological, very information technology questions, but I think it's more than this, in a sense that the question we ask, information technology is profit, fantasy, or pariah. And this again goes back to the idea that the same question, not as far as the informational technology, but I think technology was asked many times in the past. Introduction of materials, glass and steel did the same questions in architecture. Do we want to use it? What's the purpose? What's the goal? Not everybody, in our case, we're not always first to adopt those materials, as we know from crystal palace and so on. So this kind of the down we want to discuss, and we are open to all the different directions as the title shows. And the second issue a year from now, it will be simulations. Again, it's much bigger way we look at this, modeling, measuring, and disrupting design. Simulation is not only digital, it can be physical. We build backups, we test them. It's material science. So it's, again, very inclusive in a sense that even though it may be associated with a computational kind of genre now, it's actually a much broader issue. And I think it's very important for us to kind of see this. So if you're interested in collaborating with us or being peer reviewer or give us comments, we have the website. It's topjournal.org on your handout. We have actually volunteer tab. You can read this. You can also guidelines for papers. Will be still work in progress, but I think it's the idea of kind of defining what the data is and the scholarship in the technology. It's very important for us.
And we want to thank our panelists for pushing us and asking us questions that are very valid and as we start this discussion.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
As I tell my students whenever I leave a review or a desk crit or something, good luck.
So kind. So kind. Thank you so much.
You're in.